essentially, the health of a business is best understood in contrast to what most people think, which is a business needs to be smart. A smart business is one that's good at the intellectual sciences like strategy and technology and finance and marketing and all the decision sciences that we learn about in business school, which are very important, very important. But a healthy organization is the one that has minimal politics and confusion and high degrees of morale and productivity and very low turnover among good people. Now, there's nothing soft about this. There's nothing touchy-feely about this. It's just the health of an organization is essentially the culture, the operational culture that allows us to tap into our intelligence. And healthy organizations almost always win because they look a lot smarter, but in fact, what makes them great is not their intelligence. It's the fact that they've created an operational environment where people get things done without politics and confusion and morale problems. And that is such a competitive advantage. It's the one that is the most untapped in today's world.
So how do we know then, Patrick? I mean, you talk about culture being the element that defines whether an organization is healthy or not, and morale, but how do you measure that? I mean, you have your vital signs for your body. What are the vital signs that you can measure that determine whether you're healthy or unhealthy as an organization?
You know, what I like to say when CEOs talk to me about this is, if we over-focus on measurement, we're probably not going to believe this is true. It's so apparent and it's so intertwined to everything that happens in the business. If we try to isolate it as a single variable and measure its impact, we're not going to be able to do that in any sort of specific, quantifiable way. It's kind of like saying, how important is the health of your marriage to the impact of your family? And if you try to measure that in terms of how much more money you're going to make or money you're going to save or the success of your kids in school, it's just impossible to do that in a quantifiable way. But you can look at things like turnover of employees. You can look at how much productivity goes up. You can look at revenue and all those other things, but they're impacted by so many variables that if we wait until we can quantify it and calculate the ROI in some very, very specific way, we'll never get around to doing it. It's so holistically important that we have to do it because we know in our gut it is the difference maker, not because we know how to measure it to the nth degree.
All right, so I'm going to focus our listeners on one specific aspect of our business that's known to cause quite a few problems and bring down the health of our business worldwide, and that is conflict. One of the reasons why I love your work, Patrick, is because of the book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and it addresses this beautifully. And so you're quoted as saying, the only thing worse than engaging in conflict is not to do so. Explain that perspective.
Well, failing to engage in conflict when it's necessary, and it's often necessary, means we are going to make decisions that are suboptimal. We're going to make decisions that don't benefit from the collective wisdom of the people around the team. And we are going to pay the price for that later. Failing to engage in conflict is a terrible decision, one that puts our temporary comfort and the avoidance of discomfort ahead of the ultimate goal of our organization. So conflict is always the right thing to do when it matters.
So, Patrick, the word conflict strikes fear in the heart of so many people. So give us some insight on why conflict has such a negative connotation, why it should be viewed positively instead, and then define what healthy conflict is so that we can get a better perspective of it.
You know, I think conflict is seen as a negative because I think we live in a society that more and more is afraid of tough love and is afraid of discomfort. And most of the great things in life come about because we decide to do something that's hard. And conflict is certainly hard and it's uncomfortable. And I think if there were one thing I've learned in the last 20 years of working with senior executives, it's that the tendency to want to avoid discomfort may be the single biggest detriment to their organizations and them growing as people. And I think that when we avoid that discomfort, we shy away from conflict. What we need to do is to see conflict in light of what it really is, and that is the pursuit of truth or the pursuit of the best possible answer. And when people sit down around a table and they have trust with one another, and remember, trust is critical here, then they engage in conflict knowing that everybody who's doing so just wants to make sure that the organization is making the best possible decision. And they know that whatever discomfort they're going to go through is in service of that organization, not in service of tearing one another down.
Patrick, I think you just explained why I am so successful. I never really knew what advantage I had. I grew up in a very conflict-rich environment, being the son of a university football coach father, conflict was part of our normal interactive dialogue. As a matter of fact, if there wasn't any conflict going on, you were being ignored. That was more painful than certainly being under the microscope of conflict.
That's true. And the thing about it is, Darren, is that people who know how to engage in conflict and recover quickly, and they realize there's no real hurt feelings, they have such an advantage in any kind of an organization. And we see this in marriage, we see it in our families, we see it in businesses and organizations of all kinds. When you can go there and then recover from it quickly, those are the organizations that are more nimble and that cycle through problems quicker, solve them, and move on. And when an organization can't do that, they're at a real competitive disadvantage.
Very interesting. So you mentioned one of the important things that has to happen is people have to understand why conflict is useful, and why people typically try to appease those around us rather than risk conflict by telling the truth or being open with ideas. So explain to us a little bit more about why appeasing is detrimental, and wanting to risk conflict is an important part of the interactive exchange that we have amongst high-performing teams.
One of the most costly reasons why we should not avoid conflict is because when we avoid conflict around issues, when we fail to disagree with people, sometimes with passion, what ends up happening is that conflict ferments into conflict around people. So if we go to a meeting and we don't want to disagree because we're afraid somebody's going to get their feelings hurt, or we're afraid it's just not politically appropriate, eventually that conflict is going to ferment and morph into conflict around that person. So we take a good conflict around an issue or an idea that we can easily discuss, and we put it off, and over time we get frustrated at those people, and then it becomes destructive. And so what I tell people is, when you choose not to go there with someone, you are going to drastically increase the likelihood that it's going to come up later, and it's going to be really painful and really hurtful, rather than around that issue, but around that person.
So the great outcome that I got from the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and the reason why I've recommended it, I've bought dozens upon dozens, I've given it out to every organization I've been involved with at some level.
Well, I appreciate that.
Is because it's not about conflict for conflict's sake. It is conflict to actually create and engender trust. And so you're the one that sort of has taught this most beautifully about how trust and conflict go hand in hand. And to most people, that seems counterintuitive. So explain the connection between the two, between conflict and trust.
It's a great question, Darren, because it's so important to realize that if you don't establish conflict with a person or on a team, entering into conflict will be a very destructive thing. Trust is established through vulnerability. That means that the people on a team or in a marriage or in a friendship have to know that the other person or the other people they're working with are capable and willing to be vulnerable, which means they can admit when they're wrong, they acknowledge when they've made a mistake, they acknowledge when other people are better than they are at something or when they have a better idea, and they're capable of apologizing. And when you know that a person is no longer trying to cover for themselves or mask their weaknesses, when you know that they're fully capable of being vulnerable, then when you engage in conflict, there's no fear, because you know if you make a good point, they're going to acknowledge it. Or you know if they make a good point, you're going to acknowledge it, because you're doing nothing but pursuing the best possible answer. So you see teams that trust one another. If you were to go into their meetings, and we've invited some into our meetings before in my company, and they'll watch us discuss things, and they'll afterwards say, man, you guys were really mad at each other. And we'll look at them like, what do you mean? And they'll say, well, you guys were really going at it. We're like, oh no, we were just trying to figure out the right answer. There was no hostility there. It was passion around the right decision. But that's only because we had complete confidence that the other person was capable of vulnerability and trust. So conflict with trust is the pursuit of truth or the best possible answer. Conflict without trust, on the other hand, is manipulation and politics and the desire to win versus to find the right answer.
Somebody said to me, Patrick, that repressed feelings and thoughts are 10 times more powerful unspoken than they are after they're spoken. So it's like the dynamic you have between a husband and a wife. If the wife has these repressed feelings and thoughts, they're 10 times more magnified, left unspoken, than once you maybe have an argument, and then once they're spoken, and it is then it's gone. It's relieved. So that's part of it, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Is involved with this as well, is that these people feel as they feel, and that's a reality, whether they speak them or not, or whether they go around appeasing everybody or not. They still have the same thoughts and feelings, but then if they're contained and repressed, they're 10 times more powerful. Once released, not that big of a deal at all. Is that part of the process too, as you would see it?
It is, and I had never heard that before, but it makes complete sense. That's a beautiful saying. I'll tell you, last night I was at church at a meeting, and I was really frustrated about something. And of course, church is where we never get into good conflict because we think it's not being nice. And I sat there in a meeting, and instead of saying something, just putting my thoughts out there, I just sat there and felt it. It seemed ridiculous to me at the time, and if I just stood up and gone to somebody and said, hey, I'm kind of struggling with this, it would have gone away. And I think what that illustrates is that when we engage in conflict, which is often just the exchange of information and difference of opinion, actually much of the emotion goes away. Now, there's going to be a little bit there, but if we repress it, the emotion builds and builds and builds, and eventually it does come out in a very destructive way.
Yeah.
Thankfully, last night it didn't come out in a terribly destructive way, but I know I went home that night feeling very frustrated. So yes, repressed emotion builds and comes out in a bad way. And I think sometimes people think, well, I won't engage in conflict and I'll just let it dissipate. It does not dissipate. It has to go somewhere.
Yeah, it actually grows. It festers like a cancer. So let's talk about the how. Tell us how we transform conflict from a team demoralizer to a team builder within our business. Give us some things you would suggest that the listeners start doing with their team.
Okay, the first thing they have to do is build trust. Before we talk about conflict, we have to make sure we have trust. And trust is a process of making people comfortable being vulnerable with one another. That means we have to know one another at a deep level. We have to get people comfortable disclosing things about themselves that seem kind of risky. I mean, we're not going to be strange and weird here, but people have to be able to come to the table and say, here's who I am. Here's what my strengths are. Here's what my weaknesses are. Here's the experiences I've had in my life. And here's the kind of person you're going to get. And most times people feel very liberated by this. They talk about who they were as a kid, and not their inner child, but just being a kid. They talk about their personality, and we use the Myers-Briggs and DISC and programs like that. And we let people say, hey, you guys, look, I'm really good at a few things. I'm really terrible at a few things. And you're allowed to tell me those things. And when people start to get more comfortable being vulnerable, then we say, okay, if we're going to be trusting of each other, we have to leverage that by disagreeing. And what we do is we first ask people to acknowledge that conflict is a good thing, but then we know that they're not going to go there right away because society tells them not to. So the leader of the team and the people on the team have to acknowledge that we're going to try to extract conflict from the team. We're going to try to be miners of conflict, if you will. We're going to try to find unspoken ideas and disagreements, and we're going to put them on the table. Now, whenever we do that, even around relatively safe topics, if you will, there's going to be discomfort, there's going to be anxiety, there's going to be guilt. And it's always true, even if it's around relatively innocuous things. And that's where the leader and team members has to do something that seems counterintuitive. And when they see people start to disagree, and when they can see that people are uncomfortable, they have to interrupt and say, wait a second. And then they have to say, this conversation is really good for our team. I know you guys feel like you're doing something wrong, but this is exactly what we need more of. And when we do that, it's amazing. And I've done this with many executives, Fortune 500 executives who you think already know this, and leaders in my church or school. When I say what you're doing is actually good, they release their guilt and their anxiety, and they get back to the issue. We have to, what I call, provide them with real-time permission. We have to catch them doing it in the moment, give them permission to continue, and teach them over time that it's a good thing. And yes, over weeks and months, people will get better at it and they won't need to be reminded.
Besides the exercises where you become vulnerable by explaining sort of the journey you've gone through in life, the success, the failures, so thus people see you more human and have there's an exchange of empathy there, so there's a bond that's created in that. Are there any other exercises that can start to stimulate conflict conversations? And I'm going to ask you that, and then I'll ask you about some ground rules around it.
Well, one of the things we do is we like to have people talk a little bit about their own personal background of conflict, and sometimes it's their personality. It's personality based. You can look at your Myers-Briggs type and say, well, yeah, this is my type, and so this is the kind of conflict that people like me genuinely engage in. And then we can do what you did and say, well, this is what it was like for me growing up. And sometimes that's because of the profile of our parents or the kind of world we lived in or our ethnicity or whatever else it is. But it's really helpful for people to say, this is who I am, and this is generally how I engage in conflict, because then it allows us to kind of have that discussion and understand that some people are going to be less likely and other people are going to be more likely, and that's a great place to start.
What about ground rules? Like one of the rules that I talk about when in terms of trying to create an environment where conflict is okay is that it's okay to attack ideas. We want you to attack ideas, debate them and argue against ideas and argue for your ideas, but don't attack people. So you attack ideas, but you don't attack people. You don't make it personal. The way that my mentor, Jim Rohn, would put it, he says you have to learn how to use love and hate in the same sentence, which means I love you, but I hate what you're doing here. I hate this idea. I hate the trajectory of where we're going, but I love you. So are there any other rules like that help conflict sort of have fertile ground?
Those are great rules too. It really depends on the group, and it depends on their conflict profile and their past. And so when you have that conversation about who we are and what we're used to, you got to find that place where people can all be relatively comfortable being uncomfortable, if you will. So it's never going to be super easy. But I like what you said. Some people will say, use I statements. I feel this way instead of you statements. You're terrible at this. Here's what I think. Do your best at coming up with those ground rules. And hopefully people will occasionally break them so that you can recover from it. In other words, if we never get to the point where we're pushing up against those ground rules, we're probably not having enough conflict. But having those rules in place at least lets us know when we've gone over the line so we can discuss that. The best thing a team can do is occasionally go over the line and realize that they can recover. What I see in my work, and again, in 20 years of working with senior executive teams, I don't have very many good stories of people having really overt, harsh conflict. People will often say, tell me a great story about people getting really mad at each other. Because we watch things on TV and we see things where people supposedly are throwing staplers across the room and swearing at each other. The truth of the matter is, in 95% of the cases, we see passive conflict. We see people not saying things or saying things in backhanded ways that never get surfaced. And that is really the biggest problem in most organizations. Now, it seems, though, that we make our ground rules so that we never experience the other 5%. So I would hate to see us putting too many ground rules that prevent us from getting close to the line, and I'd rather see us getting a little bit messier and then learning how to discuss that afterward. But certainly not making, attacking statements, and I love what you said. We have a saying in the church, love the sinner, we're all sinners, and hate the sin. Tell somebody when they're doing something that's not productive, but it's not a condemnation of them as a person, but of their behavior. And I love what you said, using the word love and hate in the same sentence. Too often what I find is that we don't say love or hate, and we think that's the politically correct way to do it. Nobody grows that way.
Yeah, I agree. So we all know that not all conflict can be healthy or positive, and you mentioned about recovering. So give us your best advice on recovering from what might be, in a situation, destructive conflict.
Well, I'm Italian and Irish and came from a family of plenty of conflict, so I've had to recover plenty of times. And that just means people have to be comfortable saying, I am sorry, and owning things. And when somebody steps over the line or gets more emotional than they should, or seems to be judging somebody or being unfair, it's really important that in that moment, or as soon as they can do so, that they go in front of all those people and say, I'm sorry, I went over the line. And the grace that people will give one another in those situations is usually amazing. And the ability of that team to rally around that person and teach each other how to keep going to good conflict is fantastic. But there has to be that level of vulnerability so that when somebody does step over the line, they can own that. And that's why vulnerability is so important, because you can't really argue with somebody who can't admit they're wrong or can't say they're sorry or can't acknowledge when other people are smarter than they are. That's why we always start with vulnerability-based trust.
Beautiful. Well, before we end, I always like to take a discussion like this where a lot of great ideas were spread. This is a big topic that's important to anybody listening, because everybody listening here has an organization that they lead. They're a part of an organization, and organizational health is everything. And we spend 80% of our lives in our business and professional pursuits and so forth. So the health of our business life is going to be the health of our overall life. So if you were to just make sure that we can transfer all these great ideas into a simple 1, 2, 3 action plan that people can get started with. So they don't just turn off the audio and go, that was great, I really like him, and maybe I'll look up his book someday on Amazon. But they can go and do something today and get started on this. What would be kind of your 1, 2, 3 to sort of break inertia and start making some change?
I would say first, the leader coming to terms with the power of vulnerability and really sitting down with themselves and saying, what am I good at? What am I not good at? And how do I hold back my organization? And the leader being vulnerable with the people they lead in a genuine way is so powerful. And then I would say, get together in a team and transfer that to the rest of the people you lead. So do some of these exercises around making your team trustworthy, and that leads to conflict and commitment and all those other things. And then finally,